the England soccer and footy and the athletes there are becoming much more sophisticated and really pushing all of their performance stats. And they're pushing on nutrition and they're pushing on recovery and mindset, because they're realizing that not only can they play better, but they play longer. And that might only mean millions of pounds to those athletes.
And maybe they don't hate it as much at the same time.
And they come out intact, right? So that it's not like, hey, it's really cool that you fought the lions in the arena, but now we're going to give your bodies up to them too. We shouldn't have to do that.
This is the Limitless Athlete podcast. I'm Tom Foxley, founder of Mindset Rx'd and your host. And I believe athletes have to learn to rewire, regulate, and dominate.
I don't know what's going to happen, but I'm willing to work as hard as I can.
There's no past, there's no future, there's just this moment right here.
If I did that, if I can get through that, like, come at me.
Changing how I saw myself, like as a man, not just as an athlete.
It's okay that I struggle. It's okay. That's part of the deal. It's how I respond to it.
Us athletes like to identify as hard chargers. We're tougher, more resilient, and more tenacious than regular Joes. As such, we pride ourselves on how we can keep on pushing when others would have stopped. Like I've said before, this is an essential skill to develop for any athlete and any human. If you gave up at the first sign of discomfort, you wouldn't get very far in life. However, your body and your mind aren't made for an endless grind. Speaking from an evolutionary perspective, we were built to work very, very hard, then rest completely and fully for a long, long time. Let's dissect this a little bit. We can break this problem down into three components: rewire, regulate, and dominate. Rewiring is the process of changing your story. The story getting in the way of most athletes is the hustle and grind mentality. I'll sleep when I'm dead. I've got to outwork the competition. Or maybe a fear trap of, oh my God, everyone's working harder than me and I'll fail if I let myself rest. Regulate is the physical side of the mindset equation. Too many athletes we speak to spend their days constantly switched on, pushing, grinding, forcing their body into the ground, which is fine if there's ample recovery too. Even your downtime isn't really downtime. The hours you spend on your phone are not the rest you think they are. Your body and mind still perceive this as work. Finally, dominate. This is on the competition floor, when we're grinding instead of flowing. Great performances don't come from a place of constant grind. They come from putting yourself in a place of effortless effort. Without these three components, minds fill with negativity and bodies just don't perform. To perform at your best by harnessing your full mindset, rewire, regulate, and dominate. In this conversation with Kelly Starrett, we discuss the value of putting the brakes on in forced downtime in order to put yourself in a better mindset place. We also discuss the value of having fun, changing your warm-ups, the greatest mindset challenge Kelly has ever faced, and a ton more besides. So enjoy this wide-ranging conversation with the wonderful Kelly Starrett. So Kelly, welcome to the show, man. It's a real pleasure to have you here.
Massive pleasure. Or as we say in the UK and the surrounding, pleasure.
Nailed it. Absolutely nailed it. Talk to me about growing up in Germany and ski racing.
I think it's a really interesting aspect of my understanding. I'm a little bit of an outsider all the time. When I came back to the United States, I was about almost seven, when my mom, who was a professor, was like, I'm a single parent. I have these friends who live in Garmisch, right in the mountains. And so the dollar was really good at the time. She packed me up to have an adventure. She had just defended her PhD, and I was a young kid. And we fell in love with this little hamlet of a little Bavarian, village. And it was really easy there. And the 80s in Germany and the 80s in Europe were definitely just a different time. I was exposed to such good sports and such good out recreation. We always carried a backpack that had, a full change of clothes, we might be swimming. We might need a rain slicker. We might ride our mountain bikes to Austria. We ski race. But what was really important about that time, where of just freedom, was self-sufficiency. We had to literally know how to drink from the hose and be gone all day, take care of ourselves, self-soothe. But also I developed this idea that whoever could do the most sports was the best athlete. Whoever could pick up the new skill the fastest was the best athlete. And so we really valued sort of being a polymath, and competency across all domains. So it was great that you're a great football player, but you also, can you ski? Can you cross country ski? Can you kayak? Do you mountain bike? Those were all the things. We were in constant play.
Why was that so important to you?
I don't know, because I suspect because, that was the currency that we valued, that the person who was the most competent really could have the most fun. And we just always were, pushing each other in so many different domains. And, one of the things that happened is that we began a beginner's mind. So I think what was fun about that for us is that we got to, at a certain age, like now we're kayaking, or now we're racing mountain bikes, or now it's, we're old enough that it's a new skiing discipline. We're skiing giant slalom or Super G. And one of the things that happens is that we got the chance to, could you integrate all those skills and then, test ourselves? And it was never a mindset of I'm better than you, ego. It was always about play, come be part of the amount of pickup soccer games I got into in Germany was insane. I'd be the only American kid. I'd ride my bike past. I'd watch a little game. People would wave me over, and all of a sudden, poop, I'm playing footy with strangers. And that kind of openness, spontaneous play, I think we've lost that narrative. It's so formal now. It's ridiculous.
Yeah, like I've recently had to just go back to playing and taking off a schedule. Like I realized it's like Monday through Wednesday I train every day, and it's always these formats. And Thursday I have a rest day, and Saturday, Sunday. And I was like, that is not the way that I enjoy training. That rigidity is just like it's not there. So it's like, now I'm gonna play a bit of golf here and there, get back to some jiu-jitsu, like get choked out way too often.
Yeah, what we see is even if we go to the founder of CrossFit, who said, learn and play new sports, right? And I think one of the things that's happened, and this ties into, being a child, we used to tell everyone, play as many different sports as you can, don't specialize, and then you can specialize when you're older. And what we saw was we had kids who came up who were like that, but had fundamental gaps in their formal movement training. Didn't have formal ballet, didn't have Olympic lifting, didn't have kettlebells, didn't have a language, sort of a reference language of teaching more formal movement. This is classic ballet before we go do modern dance. And what ends up happening is then those inefficiencies sometimes bit people in the ass. They could have been a little bit stronger, a little bit more durable. They could have been a little more skilled and exposure to things that sometimes you just can't expose swimmers to with more swimming. And what we realized is that all that model, play, plus a little bit of formal movement, you're really capable and competent. We can look at energy systems, we can look at strength, right? But then all of a sudden we became hyper specialized, as happens, because I think it's a feature of us sort of the internet breaking down walls, suddenly having access to so many strength communities and really advancing strength and conditioning game besides like old Russian, literature that was translated, all that. And so subsequently what we saw was we had hyper specialized kids and athletes who played one sport who we had to, because they didn't grow up playing a whole bunch of other things, we had to do even more formal movement training. In fact, today's kid needs more formal movement training than 10 years ago and an order of magnitude more than 20 years ago in terms of teaching kids to do handstands and jump and land and roll and play. And so what we've seen is that these kids have come through these programs and are really good at their sport, but aren't developing enough capacity. And as a feature of that, we've also seen adults like you become, or myself, it's easy to become entrained in very formal movement in the gym. And the gym is a really great place to test. We say it makes the invisible visible. We can really understand what's happening. And yet we're not going outside. Now I'm trying to recreate every rotational plane with a medicine ball in the context of training. And I'm spending 2 hours in the gym, 3 hours in the gym. how many days a week, where, and we've forgotten that the reason we were in the gym in the first place was to go train and play. And it's important, I think, for people to recognize that it's easy to say, hey, I got better because I added a kilo on the bar. That's really cool. But unless the shot put is going further, unless you're a faster runner, unless you're better at jiu-jitsu, what's the point of that thing? Is it just body composition? Is that what we're lying to ourselves about? Is the current gym culture just about aesthetics? Cool. Let's just own that. But if we're serious about using the gym for what its possibility is to make us durable and to highlight positions and techniques and skills that we then transfer back into real sport.
Yeah, and then somewhere along the line as well, your mental approach and like the pure enjoyment of it just fades as well. Like that's what I found for myself anyways. Like it just becomes linear, it becomes unexpressive, it becomes unenjoyable. And like and it's so much more fun. Well, for me personally, I'm speaking for myself, that phase of skill acquisition, especially at the beginning, you just learn, your mind is just like thinking about it the whole time. It seems like the best thing for a human being.
It is. Early on, I mean, we always laugh. One of my friends says, hey, I'm all about those beginner gains, and I'm like, yeah, when you thought about it, I was like, that is really what I want too. I just want the massive acceleration. Look how good I am. I couldn't spell the word snowboard, and today I'm snowboarding. That learning is so addictive. I'm listening to this book right now called Sand Talk by Tyler Yunkaporta, who is an indigenous Australian writer, thinker, philosopher. And what's really interesting is that he basically, the summation of the book, and it's really wonderful, Sand Talk, it's about how we can use indigenous ways of thinking to solve complex modern problems, pattern recognition, interrelationships. It's really remarkable. But we have completely jumped the shark on how kids learn and how best to acquire skills. And that is through interrelations, that is through play, that is through joy. And the things you just described are the reasons it's so fun to initially get in there. Then it's work. And look, at some point, you're a modern football player playing in the Premier League. We need to get some work done. It's not very sexy. That's very different. That's like, I take this vitamin and I'm doing this thing. That's not the best way to learn skills. That's developing physiology. And that's cool. But no wonder we burn all the kids out by the time they're 18. The research around kids playing and continue to play sports past like 16 to 18 is abysmal. We have nearly 100% participation, and it winnows down to like 15%. And so we really have to look at, is the gym class really the best place to acquire these skills? Well, in the way we're currently teaching it, no. So humans play and humans learn together, and they love to pick up skills and challenge. And suddenly you can see why getting people to compete for a point, which is dumb. Don't get me wrong. I'm not a huge fan of competitions and workouts, who can go the fastest and do the most dumb work. But I am thinking that if you and I are going next to each other, we're always going to have more fun because it's suddenly an informal game, right? A spin class next to someone where you're actually competing wattage, that's super cool. Or climbing on the mountain bike. So we have to recapture that and reintegrate that play. And one of the best lessons for me is teaching and coaching my daughters, because I'm like, look, they're water polo savages. They are such good water polo players, but I have to balance how am I going to get this training in so I can protect them and keep an eye on their internal rotation, do all the formal things, and yet make that so fun and such an enjoyable experience. They don't mind going out and working with their dad. That it's like we're messing around or doing handstands or listening to music, where, you know what I mean? Where we get sidetracked and we've just lost that narrative because we know we can get so many gains of physiology, but we're forgetting the whole thing. How can I better relate to you as a human? How do I better relate to my environment? How am I using the gym to facilitate those things? And the gym culture potentially is really great. It's a really rich tribe, not always.
What do you do for play at the moment? Like, what's your skill acquisition?
From a hyper technical dorky thing I'm working on, I'm trying to teach myself to juggle with pins, but I use it as a warm up because the number of times I drop a juggling pin and have to bend over and pick it up, it's insane how many hinges and squats I can get done in 20 minutes of play. And I'm hot and sweaty and frustrated. I just had a lifetime PR last night. I actually, for a moment, was looking. I was like, look at me, I'm juggling. And then I, went through a window.
Always it's like meditation. I'm meditating.
Hey, look, shoot. My wife and I huge mountain bikers. I've been riding my bike and racing mountain bikes for a long time, but we have really fallen in love again with mountain biking in a really significant way. And I think that's, I love to paddle. I've been a professional paddler for a long time, so that skill set's pretty stable. I'm going boating next weekend. I have a brand new kayak. I can't wait to get out and play it on the river. But the mountain biking and all the things around that are really interesting right now. So I'm continuing to play that.
Yeah, all those things are so. There's such a difference in depth of field, like your focus. When like you find that plane when you're outdoors, and you kind of just your pupils dilate. It seems like, and they actually constrict, don't they, to let more light and a wider lens. It seems like that also just getting outside.
Well, you really are hitting on something, and it's coming back to this common theme. Like, look at the kids at Z Health, or there's a really great German company, Neurokinetic Health, and there's so much eye tracking that we're needing to do with people, and that you've seen the pencil push up, and that like suddenly, stimulation through your optic nerve and changing, and doing some saccades or some convergence of your eyes really does change how your body perceives safety or threat or opens up. And I'm like, why do I have to do that formally? Which begets the question, why am I doing any of this formally, right? If I ride my mountain bike and I'm looking at my, how far I've gone and then refocusing, or looking at a route and then looking far, aren't I getting plenty of that? Or if I'm actually playing a game where I have to catch something, I mean, do I really need to then do more formal movement training with my eyes? Maybe not. But what they found out was, wow, we see people 3 feet, a meter from their screen and not doing any diversity. And suddenly it's a game again where exactly what we're talking about. I'm having to add these things back in instead of solving these things with a movement game, actual activity or skill.
Yeah. So I spent like the 2 years before I moved back to the UK living in BC, and I was outdoors the whole time, like ski mountaineering, mountain biking, climbing. And I was just like, things felt really good. And I came back and it's like, right, time to focus on the business and make sure it's working. And man, like I remember looking out, I've got some trees over there. And I was like, can't actually focus on them anymore. Like, it's completely changed. And like, I noticed such difference in my mood as well. And then I was like, I need to be outdoors more. Hence why a bit of golf, bit of like loads more running, some cycling, like just changing up. Like, and that again, it's the playfulness. It's the kind of the newbie games as well, which I like. Yeah, I live for those. But it's it's fascinating to see that the play and the outdoors effect on mentality and general health.
One of the things that I really like to do, there's a coach named Dane, I think his last name is Miller, Dane Miller, and he's Ghost-Faced Mila on the socials. But he jumps in and tries everyone's programming. And he's a monster. He's a prodigy of Bondarchuk. He's an Olympic coach. He's just a mutant human being, works with a lot of throwers and track athletes. But also, I love him. I see him like, he's like, I'm going to do Joel Sieben stuff for a while. And then I'm going to play over here for a while. I'm going to try this. And one of the things that we've gotten from the internet, of course, is just really lazy tribalism. No, I'm a hard style kettlebell swinger, high bar, low bar back squat, whatever floats your boat there because it gives you meaning. That's totally fine. But it's a great place to use your warm up as a chance of play and discovery. So you see something on the internet and you're like, wow, this is a really good coach playing around with something. I wonder what that feels like. Go feel it. Go explain. Use your 20 minutes. Like, I am a constant player and developer, and my warm ups are a place where I try new skills and I try things out, and it gives me a chance. Because look, at some point you're going to need to pick something up off the ground and put it over your head and breathe hard. Those things are not negotiable. I mean, that is, if you want to be durable and actually be athletic and not just use movement as entertainment, which is what a lot of the internet is full of now. It's like, instead of going to dance class, I'm going to go to this exercise class, right? Or, I'm going to do this, animal flow, not throwing shade on anyone. I'm just saying that there's a lot of movement, which is great, but it's not going to get us to the Olympics or get us to world champions. I like to have the idea of a lot of play in life, a lot of play in warm up, balance, play, mess around, discovery. But there are some more formal things for adults that are appropriate that get us over the line in the least amount of time, right? Like, I kind of feel that way. And yet I'm still saying to you, you can do whatever you want, however you want to express yourself in the gym. It's really none of my business. I don't really care. But if you're trying to make a claim that your system is the best and it doesn't develop other people's systems, doesn't develop your capacity in other systems, then maybe it's less effective than you think. So coming back to our central tenet, I like to take my training and see how durable and transferable it is in someone else's ideology. So if I'm going to do Ben Patrick stuff, who's a friend, I should be able to do all the stuff without having to do any of the stuff. Right. And that's what I want to be able to do. I want to be able to say, well, I choose this modality or this style of training, but it's not limiting my growth or potential. And again, now I'm just using the gym as a way of saying, can I pick up a new sport quickly? Can I quickly adapt my skills and physiology to a new task, which is ultimately what I think we should be doing as humans, collecting skill.
People love clinging onto a tribe and sort of finding that security.
Sure, we need
like,
it.
yeah, this is, yeah, exactly. But there's also like the kind of the lack of being willing to stand by yourself and go and do something that's like kind of stand outside, especially when everyone is not conforming gets like a bad rap, but like kind of trying to find security, safety, stability from a social structure. Like you always seem to be, from my observation anyway, and what is basically very, very limited because I've seen you on Instagram, I've read your books, and that's basically it. We've actually chatted once before on a previous podcast, but that's been it. But it seems like you're willing to kind of stand outside the crowd of it, like kind of think for yourself and have like hold your opinions. Did that, like, you seem to have a unique upbringing as well? Do you reckon those are correlated?
Possibly, being an outsider. The other thing was, for me, the way I learn is through pattern recognition. So that if you ask me, like, pin me down, like, Kelly, what is your one true gift? What is your superpower? I'm like, it's pattern recognition. I understand how things relate and how systems connect. That's how I understand the world. And it's really interesting. I'm like, if you, again, we're back to this relationship thing. No thing is in isolation. I'm a systems thinker. I need to think about how these things connect and how they interrelate, which turned out to be in physio and strength and conditioning really, really useful, because I can quickly grok and understand what you're trying to do and the tools the tactics you're doing to try to do it, or the tactics you're using, maybe not, solving a problem that you're trying to solve. So what's great about that view then is that suddenly everyone is fair game. Everyone has ideas that integrate, synthesize, all Buckminster Fuller, the thinker, is like, hey, look, all systems that are true and correct are mutually accommodating. We have different language, we have different jargon, we have different tactics, but the principles are the same. So where we have these moments of interference are genuine interests of discussion. Why you believe that? Is it your history because you came out of a system that believed that? Is it because, or you come to believe that because you tried to solve a problem and weren't able to solve that problem, and so you got stuck here? So for me, I think being in the strength and conditioning community is so fun because there's so many ways, so many roads to, roam. And I'll give you an example. Coach Ma, Chinese Olympic lifting coach, I adore him. I'm friends with Dmitry Klokov. I watch how he lifts. Travis Mash is a good friend of mine. Dave Spitz is a really good friend of mine. Coach Bergner is one. I have these like just incredible Olympic lifting coaches and friendships. Olympic lifting, they all have different styles and different means of training and different, but it doesn't mean that I have to choose one. If I'm an athlete, I'm like, okay, I'm in your programming system. But what I'm trying to understand is, how are these things alike? How are they different? And which one gives me the best outcome? And which has the best understanding and linkage to other things? So, once again, I think it's interesting for me to go ahead and continue to play and be interested. And that's why I particularly find it offensive when the only way people feel like they need to get attention is to shout other people down. I just think it's so boring.
Yeah. With that in mind, tell me about your least favorite person in strength conditioning. So when you, what were you up to when you realized that your mobility physiotherapy was the thing that you were going to pursue?
Oh, man. I was an injured athlete. So I paddled on the U.S. canoe and kayak team and injured myself through an overuse injury. I had basically a brachial plexus traction injury. So I injured the nerves come out of my neck. And that was because I was missing internal rotation. I was a mouth breather. And I had all these, I paddled canoe on the right side of the boat 11 to 13 times a week. It was just sort of a disaster, right? Like, why would I do that? Why would I just be so asymmetrical? And in retrospect, I'm like, oh, that was completely of my making. But that ended my hand went numb, couldn't turn my head. And that was my first experience. 22, 23. Yeah. 23, 24, maybe, something like that. Perhaps 24. And, that was definitely brutal, and I went down the physio hole where you suddenly I'm like, give me the cortisone, give me the prednisone, give me the traction, give me the acupuncture, let's do the massage, let's do MRI. I tried everything. I was like, I will be willing to give you my kidney so that I can just get back to doing what I want to do instead of understanding everything else. And at the time, not only was I paddling that much, 11 workouts a week, I was also in the gym and also riding my bike and also swimming and doing zero recovery. No one was looking at my positions. The only thing we valued was I 1 second clock faster on the clock? Yes or no? And that sort of is like, and I've said this before, hey, the mentality of like, I made you some toast, but I burned down your house. But isn't the toast good? It's the best toast you ever had. But there's a wake of destruction in the pathway of making that toast. So I discovered I needed to go to physio because I thought I could solve this problem and there had to be a better way. And I was always interested in how the body worked, how to nutrition. And some of that was because I was an athlete in the late 90s, early 2000s, and it was the dark ages. I've told the story before, but I was like, I think plyometrics, I'm not really sure what that is, but medicine ball work seems to be important in these other communities. The internet we're pre-internet days, which I think is shocking to people. And I got a book at the library I found it was by Tudor Bompa, and it was like medicine ball training. And it basically was stick figures with medicine balls, just folding left and right and rotating. And I asked my girlfriend's parents at the time for a medicine ball for Christmas, and they got me a huge medicine ball, like 18-pounder, 20-pounder. And then my best friend and I, who was also on the team, we went to the gym, and for an hour we played with medicine ball. And we were so crippled. We were crippled for days. Like we couldn't rotate, we couldn't flex, we couldn't twist, we couldn't paddle. And I was like, whoa. And my friend got so mad at us because he's like, dude, like we messed ourselves up. And I'm like, we didn't know. And there was nothing in the book about how to on-ramp or what's appropriate volume or to get started. We just started in the front of the book and went to the end of the book. Like we should just do each one of these for a while and see how it feels. And just imagine just all the exposure that we had with that medicine ball when we were young, fit kids. And so, I think because I was always interested in these things, physio made sense to me. When I got into physio school, I discovered that the language of rehab and the language of injury had nothing to do with the language of training. And that's when I started to run this gap because I owned a gym while I was in physio school. That's when I opened my gym and was suddenly working with populations, helping people learn the language of squatting and pressing and Olympic lifting, kettlebells, and people couldn't even get into these shapes. And I was like, whoa. Like we can wait till you're just injured and broken and then go to physio and get you out of pain and then come back and you still haven't reconciled your position or improved your technique or loaded. You've just done this babysitting over here in the physio land. And that's when I saw a real opportunity to basically create this, sort of performance therapy idea where we were looking and using the formal movement language of the strength and conditioning centers as a diagnostic tool in real time to see if people could maintain their positions. And what I realized is that the physio world wasn't about shapes, it wasn't about positions, and it wasn't even about exercise. It was really about being compensated for pain or no pain, or helping people babysit people appropriately so they didn't injure themselves during a healing model. That was really what physio was. And it wasn't on the side of how do we help you snatch or create this Olympic record or run faster or do all of those things, which turned out to be a really nice life. I fell into this thing and sort of realized I wasn't ever going to be over on that side. And suddenly we realized, man, there's a lot we can move into the domain of the coach and the domain of the athlete that had nothing to do with physio.
Hey, if you're enjoying this episode, chances are you'll enjoy our free ebook, How to Stop Substandard Self-Critical Plateaus and Unleash Your Potential. It's a step-by-step guide to finding your mojo again and getting back to the athlete you know you can be. It's free. You just have to stick your email address in and download it. To find it, head to mindsetrxd.com/ebook. That's mindsetrxd.com/ebook. Now, let's get on with the show. You really are a systems thinker, aren't you? Like that's the way you see things. Like you can see the holes picturing up in these systems as you're going through it.
It seems obvious. Sometimes when you're in it up close, it's difficult to. And I think as a coach working in a team, you have to be thinking this way. The physios, keep coming back around to this thing called like the biopsychosocial model, right? Mm-hmm. And you can see why that's a reaction because the physio community wedged themselves up against the medical model and the medical system for reimbursement and, to get bona fides and to be legitimate in the eyes of modern medicine. And it was all about mechanics and tissues, right? And there was no conversation about the human or the brain and the body or the body and the brain or the mind and the brain. And for me, that stuff was so obvious because if you're an athlete or you're a coach of athletes, you have to talk about sleep and nutrition and stress and mindset if you want someone to be worth a crap while they compete. And so if you don't feel safe in your team, it doesn't matter how fit you are, you're going to suck. And so suddenly I was like, well, why are you just discovering that? Oh, you're discovering that because you actually aren't working with real teams and real people. You're working with a snapshot in this 30-minute session inside a wall with a low ceiling and padded floor, and you're getting paid no matter what the outcome is. There's always someone coming. So I realized that there was a lot of type 1 errors in the physio, and the physios, suddenly were like, well, pain is in the brain. We're like, well, no crap. Have you ever been to the gym? It's always painful. There's always something going on. Have you ever done a sport? Like, you're always hurt and always managing something. We're always working around something or regressing or progressing something. That's because that's sports and athletics. And so we already had a really different conversation around pain, for example, and that we didn't see pain as the limiting factor of the only conversation. Oh, you don't have any pain? Go on with your life. It was always about, oh, you have pain and you have to win a world championship. How are we going to solve those things? Who owns that? And how are we going to manage that? That's a very different set of conversations, and one I think that is scalable.
Yeah. This leads me really nicely onto you kind of spoke around it there. Do we know much about the effects of mental state on mobility? Is there a correlation?
Oh, yeah, for sure. Let me ask you, if you're super nervous, how well do you move?
Poorly.
So,
just like my golf yesterday. Yeah, pressure.
Isn't that interesting?
Like tightness.
How about this? Go ahead and have a baby, then go run a marathon, then take a red-eye plane, and then let's go play golf again. And just let me know how that goes for you. You're going to be terrible. Mm-hmm. Oh, I just described you being a professional athlete, having to manage all those things, right? I mean, that's welcome to the game where you're like, holy moly. It's not even about who's the best athlete. It's who can manage the most variables and be the freshest in that moment. So a lot of the things we do as coaches is say, well, what can we control for? How many of these, detractions, these vampires can we account for so that the athlete can just show up and be the athlete? Like, we just want it so that we can take the best athletes in the world and actually give them an opportunity to show their virtuosity and their hyper creativity and their, what's it called? Transient hypofrontality. That's the idea of flow state. And, we want to be able to control as many of those things as we can: nutrition, preparation, strength, conditioning, all of those things, so that you can just go and do what you do. If you're in pain, if you're stressed, how are your tissues handling that? So now we're thinking at a systems level. Wow, you're eating like a spoiled brat. You're drinking a ton to make yourself feel better, just because that's self-soothing. That's a legitimate strategy. You're not sleeping. You're not eating right. You're drinking. What's going on with your tissues? And so suddenly we're at this idea where, hey, mobilization and mobility and having access to your position, which, by the way, these normative shapes are the same shapes and ranges of motion that every doctor, physical therapist on the planet agrees with. So the fact that your ankle doesn't flex is an anomaly. It's like a disease. It's a strange state. What do you mean your hip doesn't move? Like, don't you think that's weird? If your car doesn't go into third gear, isn't that a weird thing? So what we suddenly realized, well, there's two ways in. There's this top-down approach. Do I feel safe here? Do I have skill here? How's my sleep, nutrition, all of those things? But also bottom-up approach can be, what's going on with the actual tissue? Do I have a stiff capsule? How does hydration affect that? I have a stiff capsule. How does habit affect that? I have a stiff joint capsule. What about previous injury history? What about loading? And so what you realize is that, man, there's two, we have to address from the top down, the brain. We have to address from the bottom up, and both are valid approaches, and both will be incomplete approaches unless you're thinking about them both.
There's a two-way conversation.
Which is why when we mobilize, for example, we're always working and talking about breath, and we're doing a ton of isometrics to get the brain and the breath involved as much as we can, so that we can influence this, how the brain is perceiving what's going on with the body.
Yeah. So when I first started doing like getting properly into mobility, and it's all thanks to you, because your like the Supple Leopard was the go-to resource at that point in my life. I noticed now looking back that my self-talk in those moments when I was doing mobility in a public space was actually kind of, it was off-putting. It was something that was getting in the way. Like before, mobility was as kind of widely accepted as it is now, and like it's really weird. Like, and that actually, the effect that had on my body, the constriction, the tension, and it's probably something to do with anxiety as well, and all these kind of things growing together. Sure. But man, like there is that kind of, it's a two-way conversation, I think, like breath and thought.
Sure. I like that. And you know when I define mobility, because again, we bandy about words, and let me just tell you what I mean, is do you have the technique and the control to express what your body's supposed to do? And that can be, man, my body doesn't perceive this as safe. That's part of it, right? That's part of that movement control system that you don't have access to. You're unskilled. You don't know how to create a stable grip as you're grabbing someone's gi. Just your elbows flaring wide, someone's gonna break your grip, right? You don't have the technique and the skills, right? It's not just about who has the biggest engine. It's about how you can connect that engine to the car, how the tires, right? What did Shelby say? It's never about, it's not about too much power. It's about not enough traction, right? And so we need to make sure that the whole system is on board from a movement perspective. How do we translate? That's why it can't just be, doesn't matter how you move. Well, certain movements don't translate as effectively or generate much force or give you as much movement opportunity. Rounding your back in a deadlift, that's not the reason why you shouldn't round your back, because you think it's injury. You heard me say that and people are like, ooh, injury. But I think that that's a crappy position because you can't breathe and you can't change directions and it's a dead end. So if you teach yourself the only way I can lift something up off the ground or jump explosively is to round my back, then that's what's going to happen because that's what you've practiced. And that just doesn't translate to VO2 max or, acquisition of skills, even though you've gotten really good at picking something heavy off the ground. Super cool. And big glutes, awesome. Don't get me wrong. But the second part of that is, do you have the raw tissue extensibility? Do you just have the tissues that can do that? And it's not always about tension or tone. Your brain isn't always protecting you. Sometimes you're what we call stiff, and stiffness is not the same thing as tightness. If you're weak or you don't have control, your brain is going to create that movement solution for you. No problem. Then here's an example. When people have an injury to their cerebellum sometimes, they can lead to a condition called cerebral palsy that people have heard of before. And people with cerebral palsy are totally cognitively intact. They just have altered motor control aspects, right? Their movement control system is up, but they still figure out ways to exercise. They still figure out, I have a ton of friends who are incredible athletes with cerebral palsy, and their brains just figure out ways of creating stability. So that's an example of you'll see someone with cerebral palsy, a typical walk is they'll turn the foot out like a duck, slam the knee and internally rotate the hip. Suddenly that ankle is stable, the knee is stable, the hip is stable. So the brain shuts down degrees of freedom for aspects of control. Boy, that sounds like you under a heavy front squat load, doesn't it? Where I don't know how to create stability. Oh, I don't have good trunk control. I'm going to either overextend and slam my facet joints into extension, or I'm just going to round until I can't round anymore and be in that position. Neither of those positions end up being very skilled. Neither of those positions should necessarily cause pain or even trauma. In the long haul, working around your physiology or not optimizing your physiology is a recipe for potential pain. More importantly, disuse, or for joints, if you're always weight bearing on the outside of your joint, that surface is designed to have the whole surface using not just a piece of the surface, right? Then you add in sleep and hydration and all these things. What we see is that, or even genetics, you don't express good collagen synthesis through your genetics. And lo and behold, that's a mechanism for an Achilles that's not working great, is unhealthy, and then gets loaded at high speed when you became menopausal. And poof, right, all of a sudden we have a fundamental tissue breakdown. So if we don't start to look at this whole thing, then what we're going to say is we're going to turn the whole thing into apologetics, which is, well, humans are just fragile and there's no good way or better way to express force or to be efficient. This is why we have to look at our elite movers and our elite movement traditions as ways of understanding what really good human expressions of human physiology and human output is. And so even in physio, we're always looking at biomotor expression. And notice that as biomotor means sort of brain, body, and expression is output, lifting, running, sprinting, cutting, speed. We are always looking at biomotor expression as the pinnacle. I do these things, I make these choices because it gives me more capacity. I do these things and make these choices because when I have more capacity, I also have more durability. I potentially have less pain. I have more access to breath, right? And I have more skills that transfer, and suddenly I have more fun. And that is why we have to get beyond, well, I got this done in the gym. Great. Let's go over to the stand-up surf. How's that foot pressure working for you? You know, oh, you just got your ass kicked on the pitch. Wonder why, you know? And that's why I think the gym and gym culture potentially confuses this conversation around sport, and why we want to keep putting and testing our thinking around sport. And when you come into sport practices and you're working with Nick Gill of the All Blacks, why he's a strength coach there, why does he believe what he believes? Why are these coaches making these choices? Because their job is on the line. They have to get good output from the athletes. They have to account for top-down, bottom-up approaches. They have to look at skills that end up being durable. Bob's your uncle.
Is there, like, because part of when I think about mobility, and part of when I hear you talk about it and everyone else talk about it and their own definitions of it come into that as well. But it seems like there can be a lot to think about, and there can be a lot to consider. Yeah. Is there like a hierarchy of where you would start? So here's your baseline, here's like where you go when you're a bit more advanced. For example, is it like movement patterns to begin with, and then is it movement patterns on the correct tension, then through full range? Is there like a place to start, and then where does, like, I don't know, a foam roller come into that, or
right?
Yeah.
You know, the first order of business always is the mover. People are still moving. And so if you're never, ever putting your arms over your head, we can mobilize for your arms over your head. But until you actually do that a lot, your brain's never going to value that, maintain that, keep an eye on that. How do we know? Because we've run this experiment for billions of years where people don't squat and their hips get tight and they have hip replacements, or they have hip pain, or they can't get up and down off the ground without using their hand. Whatever ends up being the solution. Loss of capacity. Why can't you flex your hip up? So the first thing that we can do always is make sure that we're moving to the best of our ability. So we put coaching and movement theory as the first order of business. So even if you can't squat below parallel, who cares? That's where you can squat. Let's squat there today. Let's not squat as you have perfect range of motion and excellent movement control, because that's horse crap, and that's not how the world works anyway. People are going to go out and play pickleball. Oh, I went to my physio. She said, don't squat, but I'm going to go out here and play this pickleball, or play this, jump in this sport, or, do kick turns. It doesn't matter what it is. You're going to use that stuff. So the first thing I think is, hey, do we have a movement practice, which is part of the physical practice, where I begin to at least expose myself to these positions? And suddenly you're like, wow, yoga makes a lot of sense there, right? Sitting on the ground and getting up and down off the ground makes a lot of sense there. And when you go into our indigenous and historical movement traditions, even our first people traditions, you'll see that there's a lot of smart thinking around how the body works and the things that we do to maintain the work of the body. If someone just did sun salutation every day, it's a pretty damn good start. You're going to touch a lot of positions. And, it's like brushing and flossing your teeth. Is that going to get you the dance? No, but it's not going to keep you from going to the dance. Then we can start to say, well, can you breathe in that position? I just made a piece of content yesterday that I think one of the easiest things people can do is learn how to develop long-term sustained force in certain positions, which is an isometric. That's the language we use. So instead of just bending over and touching your toe, even if you did like a classic hurdler stretch, right? Whatever that means, stretch, whatever the hell that is. I can get you to at least contract the muscles at the ends of your range and get you to breathe there for a minute. And boy, I'm going to give your brain's going to be like, look at this. We own this shape. We can breathe here. We can generate force here. So those are the first orders of business that I drop in. Can you contract in the position where you're working? Can you control that? And the easy thing to do is just drop in an isometric in whatever you're doing. And then 2, can you breathe in that position? And if either of those conditions aren't met, then what are you doing? You're not, you're being tortured. You're being pulled apart, right? So suddenly, I think if you dropped into Pilates or yoga or active release technique or strength count, you're like, oh, I understand PNF. It doesn't matter what languages. You're like, oh, everything's coming back to 2 things pretty much. I'm either doing an isometric or I'm doing some eccentric iso or tempo work where I'm slowing down. So the first order of business for us is skill acquisition, but we don't have to just stop there, and we aren't, because I'm trying to get you to sleep more. I'm trying to get you to drink some water. So I'm always working at multiple systems simultaneously. Ideally, as a coach, I can come in and say, oh, I see that you're squatting regularly and you're sleeping and eating food. Great, then we can have the next conversation. But some of those things, we see that people have these super friable, dry, crappy tissues. I'm like, maybe that's the first order of business. You should eat a fruit and vegetable. You need to drink some water with some salt in it. Then we can really unlock your potential. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Absolutely does. When we are talking about, and this is particularly pertinent, my fiance is just she's 12 months out from ACL surgery and whatever they do with it, squeeze the old I can't remember what it is. There's something on the side, something on the lateral side of your knee that they pull and tighten when hypermobile people at the same time as the ACL to kind of, I think, suck it all together essentially. And that's been a gnarly journey for her. And there's potentially some sort of shoulder challenge that I might be having after an MRI. All of that leads me to think like injury and surgery rehab. What are your protocols for creating safety, stability, security from a mental state and a physical state, like the link between those? I know that isn't really a question, it's just a jumble of words, but would you be willing to run with that?
Yes. The first thing is, when I was talking about mobility in the beginning with breathing and contraction, I was just talking about position. And you see how suddenly mobility means I'm in pain, right? And how I manage that. And so suddenly the conversation is swung into, do I know how to self-soothe when something hurts? Well, it turns out a lot of the techniques around restoring position, and remember, if I improve your position, I improve your movement. If you're in pain and I lessen your pain, I'm lessening your pain so that you can restore position so you can move. So it always comes back to the reason we're trying to get people to desensitize or self-soothe or heal is so that we can move again. So that's really always the goal. So when you look at it from that perspective, then any technique style that improves movement efficiency, movement economy, and enables me to move is a fair game technique and a fair game tool, which means I have my own set of tools I like. And if you don't like them, as long as your tools are doing the same thing, super cool. I just happen to think that when we get people into better physiologically, more stable functional positions, oftentimes their pain gets better. And that may be just simply because you're moving differently and the brain recognizes this new pattern as threat-free. Simple, cool. When we're realizing that people are in pain, there's a lot of things that we can steal from that performance side. Isometrics, addressing trigger points through isometrics, contract, relax, addressing soft tissue, which maybe is blood flow or desensitization or decongestion. All of those things can be happening in there. If you lay on a roller and flex your quad, I've actually just figured out a sneaky way to do this really localized loading. It's just a different kind of loading that's happening there. You're doing isometrics, right? You're getting movement without motion, but it's just a sneaky way of loading a tissue on that spot. So no wonder that turns out to be very effective. For when we're training around rehab or injury, this ends up being a lot more complicated because the real question is, what were the behaviors? Were there any behaviors that I engaged in that could have prevented this or changed my outcome or made me more durable or less susceptible to this, right? Hypohydration, overreaching, too much change in volume, those things. We tend to believe that if we can control for the variables but we keep talking about these environmental variables and movement quality variables, and we manage your volume, you're pretty durable. We can get a lot more out of you than we think we can. When you're injury or status post surgery, the first order of governing body is you're either going to heal at the rate of a human being or you're going to heal slower than that. So there's no such thing as a fast healer. You either heal at the rate of a human being. And by the way, that's all the same within a few days. There's no such thing. You're either healing slowly because you're inflamed and your tissues are congested and swollen and you're not moving. But if we maximize for those things and account for those things, then really what we're doing is just saying, hey, how do we progressively load the tissues during these tissue healing phases so that we don't disrupt sort of the new cakes that are just setting. So we know, for example, that ACL is really grown in at 12 to 14 weeks. Everything's super stable, but it's going to take a year before that thing's really ready to go, and 18 months because it takes that long for the tissues to really set up, the fascia to be reorganized, the tissues to be fully matured. And we know that because when we send out athletes to the pitch, when they don't have that time, they're more likely to get re-injured, right? And so ultimately, for example, I don't use a lot of fancy corrective exercises, just not in my language. And I felt like that was really covered well by so many experts. What I ended up doing was using regression and progression of the movements that we're using in the gym, because that's a universal language that everyone speaks. And instead of using corrective exercises, we use these regression progressions of our exercise so we can continue to say, hey, rehab, back to the Olympics, we're just still pressing overhead the whole time, right? And there's so many ways to get around that. But what we're doing is modifying for position, we're modifying for speed, we're modifying for cardio respiratory demand, we're modifying for load. And ultimately, the return to sport is, and guess what? In ACL recovery, this is very interesting. One of our coaches is a USC, University of Southern California, best PT school in the world, sports resident, and all the best metrics of return to sport for ACL injuries are subjective readiness scores. Do you feel ready to play? Yes, I do. Do you feel like your knee will allow you to do the things you need to do? No, I don't. Not jump, not triple test, not anything, because the brain knows if the body's ready, yes or no. You know what I mean? And that's, I think, when you come back into that, then why are these systems, why would they ever be wired apart? They're not. We just happen to know how long it takes for a sprain to knit itself, or how long for an Achilles to grow in, or for a bone to heal into an implant. We just happen to know those things. But again, I would argue that the same sets of techniques and tools we're using for performance, decongestion, jumping Normatec boots, using NMES to decongest the tissues, soft tissue work to lay DOMs and keep tissues from being stiff. All of those techniques can be applied to injury and surgery, and applied to going faster and doing more volume.
Yeah, that's where I'm interested in that is because part of it will be sometimes your brain lies to you, right? Sometimes it does. It's not always perceiving the same information, or as the example being.
If you have fear, for sure, I would believe that, right?
Yeah.
But I would say that you're just not listening. Your brain is perceiving what's going on. There's a lot in that in terms of your previous injury history, your belief effects around pain, how you handle this culturally. All of those things are important. But I would say that your brain is pretty good. If your brain's saying don't put the leg down, then we haven't done enough behaviors to get your brain to think this is a safe behavior.
Then we get back to then we get back to proof. We're proving to ourselves that it is safe and it is a good thing to do. It's interesting that you're talking about it's basically a conversation that we have time and time again on this show. It's trusting that sensation. And we're talking to previous Olympic swimmer Caroline Burkle on the episode before you.
Oh, yeah.
And she was talking about
incredible.
that. She is incredible. And she's just talking about that kind of being pushed for splits and quantifiable data the whole time. And she was someone who just responded to that feeling of performing, and that feeling, and she got so far away from that, she had to learn to trust that again and trust that kind of sensation. So it seems like we're pushed away from that at the moment. We're pushed away from
that's a coaching failure. It's a coaching failure and an athlete failure. It's a coaching failure because it's easy to track those things and prove that what I'm doing is working. It's really messy to have a hard conversation with an athlete and say, how you feeling today?
Especially when they're a child.
Tell me more about that. Exactly right. At some point, there's a reason, if you look at some of these other traditions of how they teach skills, it's play-based and so much repetition and so much practice. And was it the Norwegians who stopped even like keeping score until you were like 16? Like it's legal to like keep score and compete. You know what I mean? Like their goal is to keep everyone in sport and de-emphasize, well, we scored more goals, ergo we're better. And, not only do coaches have to become better at understanding humans, but athletes have to take it on themselves now to become much better athletes. Well, if you're stressed out and coming to practice, how are you going to play? Why aren't you handling your crap at home? If you're poorly fueled before you go to practice, whose fault is that? So it's easy to be like, man, my program doesn't work. My failure, I just jump around and flit around. But, also we have to start at much earlier age where Burkle is saying, hey, I feel like something's off, and I can be vulnerable in front of a coach, or I can have this conversation. Man, that's reforming sport, isn't it? Right. And those are conversations that have to happen for decades so that you can get to a place where you can trust the athlete. I don't feel like this, or this is not happening, or how much do you need to be able to handle this volume? And then also agreeing on metrics of performance. If Caroline's like, hey, this is, I'm swimming below this, I don't know why, then we can become curious about that. But now what we're realizing is that it's a much more of a conversation. And we say this about clinicianship. Expert clinicianship is a conversation between patient and provider. But that's what and that means it's a compromise. I'm not some patriarchal guy who's like, you're going to do this. You agree what you think is the best for you. I have input into what I think is the best for you. We're going to come up with a compromise of what you think you'll actually do. That's what good coaching is. And that means the athlete has to own that. I'll give you an example. England, and the England soccer and footy and the athletes there are becoming much more sophisticated and really pushing all of their performance stats. And they're pushing on nutrition, and they're pushing on recovery and mindset, because they're realizing that not only can they play better, but they play longer. And that might only mean millions of pounds to those athletes.
And maybe they don't hate it as much at the same time.
And they come out intact, right? So that it's not like, hey, it's really cool that you fought the lions in the arena, but now we're going to give your bodies up to them too. We shouldn't have to do that. And that is a worthy thing to work on for the rest of our lives, right? Is to get people to feel and to trust and to make that part of this conversation. And one of the things that I would point everyone to who's listening is to look at Brett Bartholomew's work, The Art of Coaching. He's really saying, hey, we have to become much better on the human communication connection side if we're really going to unlock, power, potential, and, sidestep a whole bunch of dysfunction. Because so dysfunctional. Coaching is so dysfunctional. Sport is so dysfunctional.
Yeah. And I think there's so many, just speaking from personal experience as well, and knowing the local community, and maybe it's a British cultural thing. There's so many coaches who I think get into coaches and they want to, or they fear being vulnerable in front of their athletes. They don't want to be that person who stands up and potentially risks a lack of trust. But the opposite happens, obviously, where they don't expose themselves. But there's that need to open themselves up, be more authentic, that people have such a distaste for. Remember, everyone comes from somewhere, right? Let me use an example that I hinted at earlier, because I just happen to know it personally. The All Blacks do a lot of coaching early in the week. And then towards the end of the week, coaches coach less and less and less. And then they're there to assist the players who are running the program. So during the week, they come up with a plan. Players learn the plan, understand the plan, and the coaches support the players in executing the plan. It's not the coaches coach their ass off during the game, micromanaging, telling the athletes where to swim, right? And if you understand anything about motor learning, then you're like, delayed knowledge of results. And, you have to let someone experiment and make mistakes and be able to self-correct. And they have to have that ability to perceive what's going on. And then the coach just happens to be this super curricular set of eyes that maybe perceive things that the athlete can't see. So it gives them some data so the athlete can make the better decision. But at the end of the week, it is on the athlete. So the athlete should know what she needs to do to get prepped. I was having a conversation with an All-American swimmer, and she was like, coach doesn't want me to swim the day before meet, but I feel like I just need these touches. And I was like, is that what your coach said? Your coach said, don't get in the pool and feel good as an athlete and
practice and feel like you have connected and be in the water and working. Is that what your coach said? Or your coach said, don't swim 1,000 meters, at 5,000 yards because, he doesn't want you to be tired. She's like, oh. So she started getting in the pool again. And she was telling the coach too, communicating, hey, I'm just going to jump in the pool, get a touch. And the coach was like, cool. And she was like, wow, I completely misread, understood what the coach was trying to protect. And that was just a communication thing. So this athlete knows herself, is able to say, hey, I think I need this to be successful. Good, let's run an experiment. And lo and behold, she became a really good swimmer.
Have you noticed a change and an improvement in emotional intelligence in athletes over your career?
I will say that yes. If I think because winning is so difficult now, I think we had fewer participants. We didn't have an example of the VHS upright, like where we could start recording things and watching things. We could practice and then emulate and learn. And if you look at the evolution of extreme skateboarding or half pipes is a good example of just like, holy crap, where were we 10 years ago? Where were we 5 years ago? Now the things that they're doing. So on the one hand, when we had kids who did a little lifting, who were stronger and ate a little better, man, they were years ahead of everyone else. And now everyone's doing that. And so that's not a competitive advantage anymore because everyone is strong and everyone's powerful and everyone's easy. So athletes are coming to realize more and more that the limiting factor is their brain and their mindset and their readiness. Why do you think that WHOOP readiness score is so great for people and bad for people, but great for people potentially? Because it really gives us some insight into connecting behaviors with physiologic markers, right? Where I can start to say, hey, I took a bath, I did some rolling, I slept better, I could work harder today, right? That's pretty cool. So what we are starting to see is that I have athletes who are very, very mature and seeking that maturity out. But I also had a generation of superstars that I'm part of because I'm Gen X, and there were always great athletes before us, but Gen X athletes are in this cusp where we had mountains of dysfunction in our families and our lives, and we used sport to cope with that. And that really led to really good outcomes for a while. Mm-hmm. And so eventually, the things that got you there, the things that keep you there, and it comes back to, do I feel safe? Do I feel loved? Do I feel protected? Now, what are the intrinsic drivers? We have to be talking about that. And more importantly, doing it, not just talking about it, right? We don't need to talk about feelings. At some point, I know that you don't want to come in and work really hard today, but we're going to run because you're a professional athlete and it's what we have to do. And it doesn't mean it has to be drudgery, but, trust me, all athletes would rather sit on the couch and watch Netflix than, suffer.
It seems like it's such a hard balance to strike with the
you bet.
with the kind of the fire, the pushing, the intensity, and fear can be a powerful motivator and driver, like that aggression that comes from it,
or the fear of failure, fear of death,
mm-hmm. Fear of success.
Yeah, fear of success as well. We're interesting. We're watching this really incredible biker right now. I think one of the hardest and greatest sports in the world right now is cross-country mountain biking. It is so hard to win. And if you think you're like, I can ride a bike, you can't. And you can't be at the limit, full gas for 90 minutes doing very technical things, gap jumps, and then also racing. I would profess that you don't have the physiology, the skills, and then you would just get killed by the racing alone. So it's really hard to win. And the people who are dominating the sports right now, top 10 men and women, are some of the best athletes I've ever seen. They're incredible. And what they're doing. There's an athlete right now named Rebecca McConnell from Australia who has been top 10 for a decade. She's really good, but she just made a big change in her life. She separated from a partner, changed her coach. And I suspect none of those things happened radically that changed and altered her programming, but suddenly she's unbeatable. And she went from being top 10 and sometimes being on the 5th podium to suddenly she's going to win the World Cup this year. And that is the quintessential power of the brain, that if we can tap into that through belief effects, through these behavior pieces, through feeling loved and supported, through self-deception, whatever it is, I don't care. I just care that it's observable, measurable, and repeatable. Like, because otherwise what we see is, man, you get hot, and then I don't know why I got hot, and then now you're wearing your hat inside out, and you're trying to replicate something you did when you were 16, and you were trying to get to some weight because at that time was that weight that you weighed was the first time you had success at your sport. And that's the problem, is that we don't really know how to deconstruct these things. If you take Supple Leopard and you look at the cover of the book, the cover is a computational leopard pattern. So here's this phenomenon in the world, in the wild, of a leopard pattern, right? That the leopard makes spontaneously, it's built in. But the metaphor of the book is, how do I deconstruct that into knowable data, into knowable components to try to replicate or understand the whole? And that's why it's a computational leopard pattern. It's not an understanding that it's always an incomplete understanding or incomplete model of the whole, of the miracle of the whole. And some of this to win is sometimes a little bit of miracle, a little bit of grace, a little bit of luck. All of those things go together. I mean, and that's why I think sport is so compelling. But when we just continue to tell the lie that whoever works the hardest wins, that's horse crap.
Yeah. To go back to the lifestyle changes, we're a human before we're an athlete. And like, I find myself telling this to athletes so many times, like, you're a human first. Like, you've got only so much willpower, only so many choices that you can make per day. And if you're relying on those to stay in a relationship that you don't want to be in, or all these other hugely or deal with like the loss of a loved one, or all these things, like, that is going to affect your performance. There's no way around that. Like, maybe it's positively initially because you get that anger and that fuel, but like, there's got to be some work outside of it too. There's got to be some work on like who you are before what you do.
I don't know her personally, but Jessica Fox is one of the greatest whitewater slalom athletes ever, and one of the greatest athletes in Australia. And only just watching her, again, I don't know her personally. I don't know what the reality is, but she is engaged in constant play, seems to have really deep ties and committed ties to her family. And I'm like, wow, that's a really hard person to beat. You know what I mean? Yeah. Her dad was Sir Richard Fox. Her mom is like a very talented woman paddler, world champion. She seems to just create a bubble where she can rinse, wash, repeat, and practice and out-practice everyone because she feels loved and supported. Here's another example. I was watching a documentary about the free divers, who, and there's a guy who lives in the Bahamas. I forget where he's from, but he said that when he was having an argument with his girlfriend, he couldn't hold his breath as long. So if there's something going on with his family at all, it interrupted how his brain was CO2 tolerant, and he could perceive that if he felt unsafe or unloved or some dissonance in his life, he wouldn't just hold his breath and fall well. So if holding your breath and falling, in a big pool is susceptible to, the stress of life, then think about what the average person is dealing with as they try to unload. It's really remarkable. And it's why we have to look at first principles. Are you sleeping? Are you eating whole food? Do you have deep and meaningful relationships? It's going to be really hard to win if you don't. And you can be built on fire and hate for a minute. That Joseph, Smith, Joseph Campbell allegory is, the dark side, is always a short game. It's not the long game.
Well, it's kind of the similar thing to the same thing that happened to Kurt Cobain or Amy Winehouse. It's like you can do incredible things in a short time, but it doesn't last very long.
Well, and remember, in those things, it helps to have this sort of objective perspective, this removed, not omniscient observer, but understanding why was that person self-soothing. Some of it is like, man, I just did heroin one time as a whim, and then I loved it, and that's super fun, and that happens, but it happens less frequently than people think. I'm trying to make myself feel better so I can perform. I'm trying to self-soothe. And suddenly you're like, oh, exercise, nutrition, these all can be mechanisms of self-soothing, right? Where, suddenly, we don't look at people. I live in Marin County, just Northern California, north of the city, north of San Francisco. And we have the highest concentration of adult binge drinking in California. Because suddenly we have very, very stressed people who have a little bit of money, upper middle class, and they drink so much wine, it's insane. And what we see though is, is that just because we're 19 and partying? No, it's because those people are trying to cope with the stresses of being kind of modern humans. And suddenly you're like, well, THC, opiates, bourbon, food control, they're all coping or self-soothing mechanisms so that I can feel better, so that I can interact with the world differently. And when you start to look at those things, some of those self-soothing or, mechanisms are a little healthier. Oh, you go to spin class? Cool. Don't confuse your spin addiction with healthy, lifestyle. It's just a different way of coping than drugs. But, we're all trying to make ourselves feel better so that we can go out and interact and interrelate to our environment, to ourselves and more effectively. And boy, suddenly you're like, well, where do I start? Because the things we're talking about here seem to be very complicated. It's not very complicated. Every day in our sessions, we circle up, we look each other in the eye, we shake hands, we ask each other how we're doing. These are people who've been training together for 10 years. We still shake hands and say hello. We have a formal ritual. We're like, how's it going? We all kind of greet each other. We, not just you bring your baggage in. I need you to come here. We all talk about what our intention is. This is our goal. Anything going on? What's happening in the world? And then when we finish, we all come back together and say, how did that go? What'd you feel? What'd you learn? A chance to integrate. That's how someone's like, wow, I felt really seen and really safe and really protected and really acknowledged. And now we can go. And then, by the way, you should probably eat some protein. Arsenal used to do this thing, and they maybe still do it, where they started delivering. Harrods would deliver bespoke, incredible meals to their players. Right? These are 22-year-old millionaires, and some people at the front office were like, "Why are we delivering dinner to millionaires? Like, this is crazy." And they were like, "Well, it turns out that if you deliver fruit and meat and vegetables to young athletes, they won't eat chips and pizza." Right? They won't go smash a bunch of curry, and which is not wrong, but it's just less effective, And so, what they realize is that it's when we start shaping the world and controlling for first principles, then we can have better outcomes without having to make another decision. And now we're into really another piece. How do I set up my world so it doesn't take all this willpower to just do the thing? I set up my world so that it's effortless and training is fun. And I come to the river, I come to the pitch, and those are my mates. And I get to explore and be creative, and then get together so we can launch an attack on that's worthy of trying to understand, because we can apply those principles to other aspects of our life, other areas of our life, business, relationships. And so suddenly sport becomes a great diagnostic tool and a great learning platform where we can really maybe potentially unlock human potential.
About 10 points that I want to jump off from that.
Sorry.
No, it's fantastic. Which one do I want to go for? That's the thing. There's like the rat park study, which I'm sure you're aware of the rats being given, all the addiction studies were based on the rats who are given water laced with cocaine, and if they've got nothing else in the cage, they hit that over and over and over and over and over until they severely inhibit themselves or die. And like that, and then they do it because that proved addiction apparently. But when you put them in a cage with other rats, the social connection, when you put them in with toys and play, when you gave them everything a rat would want, most of them hit that once and then never touched it again and would go back to just standard water. So it's that addiction piece and non-serving behaviors is like more complex than drug equals hormonal response or neurological response equals repetition. And like that must be, it must be on the other side, it must be a similar thing with forming positive habits about movement practice, mobility. Like if you're in that safe environment, if you have that mentality and mindset and connection, that is going to encourage those kind of behaviors more often. It seems kind of trite to say.
Ask an adult, do you like running? And they'll be like, I hate running. Tell me more about that. And they're like, well, it doesn't feel good. I'm like, oh, that's really reasonable. You run, it doesn't feel good, hurts your body. But what if I taught you to run? What if running had application or a skill, right? It wasn't just like I'm running to get skinny. Exactly as you're saying, The real question now is we can peel back another layer and say, well, what if I want to be a durable person and I want to be 100 years old and functional? What's the minimum effective dose of this exercise training? I want athletes to have more free time to paint and read and think and mess around, not to foam roll and percussion gun and eat and meal prep and be robots. I want to do the least amount in the gym as possible with the most fun so that we can have the most time off. One of my favorite coaches in the world, and I highly recommend everyone read his biography. His name is Anson Dorrance. Anson Dorrance is the most successful coach in the history of coaching. And he coaches the women's University of North Carolina soccer team, their football program. And he has made more World Cup, basically invented women's national soccer team in this country, has put out more superstars on the planet than you can imagine, has won more national championships than any other coach in any other sport. And how he runs his program is really amazing. And some of the things that they work their asses off, but then they're goofy off the field. That when they're on the pitch, they have standards that the girls have to hit, the women who train with him. And if they don't hit, they get punished by their own teams. And I don't mean punish, I mean punish physically, like it's really difficult to keep up and you're going to have to run more. But he doesn't care if you show up hungover and you're a human being, just do your work, handle. So there's standards where we all agree that this is what our standard is going to be. But then every match, every game, those are all true also, but every practice is a chance to compete where they actually track all the metrics. So it's 90 minutes because that's how long a match is. That's how long his practices are. But they are scripted, formal, intentional. They try things, they iterate, but they track everything. So you and I run for the ball, you win the ball, you get a point, I don't get a point. And so they've created, he calls it the competitive cauldron, where they're constantly playing and competition is a form of play. And suddenly everything matters, the intensity and the density of that training. And then when they're off, they're off. And I really respect that, because what we don't want to do is we want someone to be an athlete and drag that whole athletic experience through 24 hours of their life. Otherwise, they're not going to be humans. So how are you going to organize and set up your life so that you can have this really meaningful relationship with your community, with your family, with your loved ones? And some of the sports that we, engage with, Tour de France, it does take 5 hours to ride someday, right? So you better have your stuff organized in a way where you can come back on the other side and still be a human being. And that's exactly what you're talking about.
Bit of a theme change, Kelly. What's been your biggest mental challenge and how did you overcome it?
I think continuing to talk about my feelings, it's, being vulnerable is a good one. I'm sure you could ask my wife. I have a ton of things I'm overcoming. In my family, no one talked about their feelings and no one was wrong. And those things can serve you very well when you're hucking yourself off a big waterfall or paddling in the World Cup, because you can just, dissociate, not talk about your stress, acknowledge what's going on. So now I've done all this work and I have all these feelings and it's complicated and I feel anxious sometimes. I'm like, what's that feeling I'm feeling? Anxiety. I kind of liked my old self, which was like, it's fine. I got this. I was putting the door down and huck. And then that wasn't very healthy. So, personally being more in touch with feeling nervous and anxious, talking about, being vulnerable. I think those things, have made me a much better human and a much more empathic person.
When did you realize that was something that you needed or wanted to change?
Just didn't always work in my relationships, and I think being married to an amazing woman and having children, you suddenly realize you're like, I have some things I need to work out about my family, and I think that, I had a missing father. My father was basically, he's passed, so I can talk crap about him. He was like the great Santini. He was a third generation Irish immigrant kid who had generations of father-son alcoholism trauma. And my dad coped the way he could and created a totally dysfunctional relationship with my mother and me. He was captain of the high school, captain of the college quarterback. He flew F4s. He was a pilot. He was just a wild man, and yet just driven by the damage of his father. So did not have a good relationship with me, and just having to work some of that anger out. I think some of the things that got me here were being a sociopath, having a single mother who told me I was probably, better than I was. And then also needing to prove to my missing father that I was worthy. That's a recipe for success right there. But it's also a recipe for massive dysfunction. I think early on I dealt with all of my desire to move and anxiety by exercising and competing. And I love that. And so I think the reason I'm not addicted to cocaine is I found sport and I found training.
Those kind of environments, they're fucking awful, but they give you something that makes you special and makes you unique and gives you a perspective that you wouldn't have gathered elsewhere.
It's one way. It's the long way around the barn for sure. But there's how much lost opportunity and capacity there. So it's interesting to run this experiment with my daughters where, Juliet, my wife, she's the CEO of our business. She's my best friend. We love to play together. We've been married. We're almost 20 years together, marriage. We've been together over 20 years. It's getting better and better. And our kids live, there's plenty of trauma in their lives. They're COVID generation. They're going to be durable and resilient. But what happens if, how do you unlock performance without having to go and find trauma to do it? That's really one of the things. Do you have to be an asshole to win and be the best? I don't think you do. I don't think you do. I think that's one way to do it, to get yourself psyched up and listen to heavy metal and hate everyone, but it may not be the most sustainable and the most reliable. So with our girls, it's really interesting to what happens if we cover all those things. They sleep and they eat food and they're in a great community and they feel loved and have all the resources. How do you, get them to have the same drive or some drive that isn't based on, trying to solve trauma in their lives? That's a great question. I'll let you know how it turns out.
Yeah, give me 30 years and then you can let me know how everything went. Yeah, it's a conversation that I always used to have with Ashley, my old landlord. We used to talk about because he had just had kids, and it was that point they're going to have a comfortable life. They're going to be safe, and for everything that I know, they're going to have a loving environment. It's how do I intentionally give them as much hardship as they can tolerate, but no more that's unnecessarily dangerous.
We go skiing in a blizzard.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Our family spends, my wife is a 3-time world champion whitewater paddler in her own right. And we spend a lot of time on the river. And take your 12-year-old, maybe she's 11, take your 11-year-old on the Grand Canyon for 18 days, make her hike, make her deal with 100-degree heat, have her be afraid of the big rapids, and there's no way out. You got to come through that. And I think that's the experiential piece where we get in the sauna, get in the ice bath, get cold. Let's go compete. Let's go perform. There's so many ways where we can create discomfort. Let's be hungry. When's the last time your kids were hungry? There's so many ways where we can do those things where we don't have to manufacture trauma. And man, it's already difficult enough just to be my girls are, cis hetero women. And, their interpersonal relationships at school is going to create plenty of trauma for them. You don't have to put trauma in front of your life. What you can do is try to create the most stable person who can be the least perturbed by drama or trauma or their lifestyle. Then, it's interesting. We're seeing, my 17-year-old loves to train because she loves to train now, but it was pulling teeth for her. We tested our kids' genetics a long time ago, and Caroline, my youngest, who is almost 5'10", she's a mutant. She's a water polo goalie. I think she's the athlete of the family. She could go all the way. She could be that good. She's 13, so what do I know? Who knows? But her recovery scores are terrible. Her ability to handle huge amounts of volume and recover aren't great. So guess what Caroline does? She sleeps still to this day over 10 hours a night. Just sleep. And if that kid doesn't sleep, it's all off. So she figured out early on, I have to sleep. Georgia, interestingly enough, is my 17-year-old, rising senior, is she's a cruise missile of a human being. Like, I just can't wait to see what happens. She's amazing. And she's captain of her team, doesn't want to play in college, but Georgia's desire to train is like 20th percentile. My desire to train is a metric of my genetics, 99th percentile. I'm like, let's go. What are we doing? It's because I basically have ADD, ADHD. But my other daughter wants to basically watch TV and bake. Like, that's her jam, right? But she's also a great athlete. And now she's practiced enough and had enough feelings and got enough feedback that exercising feels good. And I don't have to like get her off the couch and throw her into the yard. She's like, I really want to deadlift 300 by the time I graduate high school. I want to hey, I want a hard conditioning piece. What should I do? And now the habits have set up where my kids know how to eat. They know how to fuel. They know how to, let me tell you a story of what I think the potential is. My 13-year-old was at this water polo camp at the U.S. Olympic Training Center this last winter. And it's for, 10, 13, whatever. It's all the best 13-year-old water polo players in the country go, and she's a goalie, and they do like 13 sessions in 4 days. It's an insane number of sessions that they're just hammering the girls. Maybe it's 11 sessions in 4 days, but she did 10,000 long tosses with the water, while swimming, throwing the ball down. And at the end of day 2, her shoulder hurt. Isn't that funny? She did 1,000 passes, volume ramps up, change in volume. And so she gets out of the pool, and the physio there is like, they're like, talk to the physio, Olympic Training Center physio. And the physio gives her a bag of ice. And my daughter was just like, are you serious? Like, that's your solution, a bag of ice? And she's like, thanks. And, in retrospect, of course, that physio doesn't know these girls, has her own job to manage. So she gives, like, I want to self-soothe. Here's a bag of ice, kid. But Caroline goes up. She's into the session. She uses a NMES device. So she decongests. It's just a muscle pumping device. She does a little scraping. She does a little soft tissue mobilization, rolls that out, gets a little non-threatening input, does some end range isometrics, return, boom, back in the pool the next day. And they're like, what happened? She's like, I handled it. And there's my 13-year-old handling her sore shoulder by herself. That's the future. And what you're going to see is that we have athletes who know how to understand their bodies and how not to freak out when that happens, and not, handle their agency away. And suddenly like, oh, no, I'm in the physio. I'm a victim. Like, here's my 13-year-old. Like, nope, I got this. I want to get back in the pool. That's the potential.
Yeah, that is sweet. And you're stressing their nervous system in a really productive way as well. Getting them cold, getting them, that's awesome. I really love that. I really love that. That's something to remember as I go to my next stage of life.
Well, I mean, it really is. And I'm really interested to see who they end up being as women, because they have every unfair advantage ever. Their mother is their mother. These kids they're savages. Good luck,
Nice. There's a few questions I like to wrap things up with for everyone. First one, I can't remember what you said the first time when we podcasted ago. Is like different name. I was in a different country, I think. And it was years ago, like 6-7 years ago, something like that. What book have you gifted most? Apart from your own.
Besides Dune, I give Dune a lot. Dune is one of those books that changes consciousness for people.
Hey man, that happened to me. You did say that last time, and I went away and read it, and I was like, oh, that changed the way that I view reality.
Yes, I think that happens a ton. I think the book I've been talking about a lot lately, obviously, Sapiens has come out since the last time we talked. I'm a huge Yuval Harari fan. That just helps us to understand sort of history and what's going on. If I could talk about the body the way Yuval Harari talks about humans, that would be a goal. David Epstein wrote a book recently called last couple of years called Range, which is about being a generalist and the secret superpower of being a generalist and not a specialist. Range is a really great book to read.
Nice. This could, I'm going to guess, be a whole another podcast episode, but what habits do you perform for your own? Let's go for mental health and performance, and mental performance too.
Sleep. So I can't talk about sleep enough. I also, I'm fortunate enough to have a sauna so the two things that are just like standards, the more stressed I get, the more sleep I get, the more stressed I get, the more time I spend in the sauna. So that's those two things have been really my new phrase or thinking is, I'm like, look, the bigger the engine, you better have bigger brakes. You need bigger rotors. And if you don't have mechanisms, there's no such thing as balance. Let's just pretend that, like, let's throw that word out, that I'm either at full gas or full brake. There's really very few in between. So as I'm speeding up and I'm slowing down, maybe those things intersect for a second where it looks like I'm in balance, but I'm either full on the gas or full on the brake. And I feel like I'm getting better and better at being full on the brake, where I'm off and free associating and thinking and, messing
It's
around.
quite difficult
More dicking around. That's what we call it.
Nice. Dicking around is the way forwards. It's quite difficult to develop that ability to stop being reactionary, because, like, I don't know about you, but when I get stressed, I'm like, I got to do more. I've got to do more. I've got to do, and it, like, the default pattern, and maybe it's a societal default pattern that we just taught, but it's like to stress more, do more, sleep less, and like keep my foot slammed on the floor accelerator wise.
That is really an artifact of our Prussian historical education, where we control groups through more work. Like our indigenous selves, we work 2 to 3 hours a day, and there's a lot of time to create art and music and interrelate and build relationships. And now we hold up work. Work makes you free has been everywhere, used by the Nazis, but it's really a real old Prussian, early German propaganda. It's like 1800s pre-Nazi. It's adopted by the Nazis. And you'll actually see that in Latin and transferred everywhere. But it was really about a society that, could work, was docile. I mean, I sound like a, conspiracy person right now, but the goal is not to continue to work and work and work. The goal is to, and don't get me wrong, there's plenty of work in your life coming up, work that you can't get out of and should not get out of, but you have to be off. You have to create a life where you're not just doing busy work, and then you're not using your only sense of timing to watch TV or to entertain or self-soothe with social media. You have to go experience and feel and interact and play and learn and drive. And that means you need to be on and then you need to be off. So I think if we can be more efficient when we're on, better, and setting ourselves up so that when we're off, we actually have the mental resources and the energy to go be interested in the world.
And I suppose that works on a seasonal pattern as well. Like there's going to be months where you're just like hammering it. Like I saw you just trying to get your 10K steps in like first thing in the morning the other day. And it's like, that's got to happen sometimes because there's the only choice.
That was the rest of the day was shot. Like I was like, well, I'm not doing anything today. So what did I do on that day? I just, I want everyone to know who's listening to this, that I have 2 daughters. I have a business. I have a whole bunch of people that I feed with our business. I feel stressed about that. During the pandemic, we lost the gym, because of regulations and not getting help. And we were our rent was $24,000 a month, and our landlords were terrible. And we couldn't even enter the building, but we could still pay them $24,000 a month. So we shut the gym down, but I ended up developing hiccups for 11 days. So I had hiccups where I was hiccuping 5 to 6 times a minute for 11 days. I lost 14 pounds. I went on Thorazine. Ultimately, it was like gabapentin, like a horse trank dose of gabapentin that knocked it down and healed. But it was an ulcer basically from being so stressed about all the people that worked with me, this thing that I had built. So, I mean, no one is immune. I had all of the resources available to me and I still burned a hole in my stomach and developed hiccups. So, the goal is to set yourself up so that we can handle these times of peak stress, death, uncertainty, loss of job, changes in relationship status, control what you can control. And then when the opportunity comes, open it up again.
Yeah. Because if you didn't have those ingrained patterns and perspectives, you would have been a write-off then, or close to.
Yeah, I wouldn't have been very useful to my family. Already with being disabled with hiccups for multiple days made me not very useful to my family. So, I think that's what's really interesting. I think also, lastly that, I'm turning 49 this year. What am I training for? I'm trained to be useful. I'm trained to transform my society. I'm trained to be useful to my family. This idea of elite performance for a 49-year-old guy who doesn't compete. I compete whenever I can, but it's just fun. I'm not professional. So, there's some tolerance in the system. You know what I mean? Like this weekend we went away and I had 3 days in a row where I couldn't train. I'm like, well, I'm just going to control my diet then these next 3 days. So that's what I focused on. And I was like, well, I'm going to get as many steps as I can and eat as well as I can. And guess what? My fitness will be there the next day. You know what I mean? Just because I wasn't on my perfect split at age 49 on Thursday in May. Come on, it doesn't matter.
Where can people find more about the Ready State and where can people follow you?
If you already aren't, just have turned this podcast off. We are at the Ready State on the socials, at the Ready State. If you want to see what my family's going around, you follow at Juliet Starrett, Starrett. Kelly Starrett is a good old Irish name. So Juliet Starrett is my wife. So I say I'm not on social media. I comment on social media, but if you want to see how we live our lives and what's going on, follow my wife for sure.
Yeah. Juliet is there's something about her that you get through social media that she's a good person. Like, and I'm not just saying that because she's your wife, but like it's just a
filter. It's just a filter.
Yeah, is it? She's horrible behind scenes.
I'm like the broken anchor of the family, keeping us back, really. Like that, she probably could have been successful. I like to point out because we work together. I'm like, you may be smarter and went to a better university and law school, but we make the same amount of money. I always point out to that. I'm like, so being a dirtbag kayaker. It pays off in the end if you marry the right person.
That's the place to wrap up a show. Thank you so much, man.
Pleasure.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Limitless Athlete Podcast. Before you head off, I have a quick favor to ask you. Please take a moment to head over to Spotify or Apple Podcasts, wherever you listen to your podcast, and leave a very kind review. It really helps us get better guests. It really helps us reach more athletes like yourself, and it kind of helps us keep on putting out hopefully useful content for you. So if you could head over there, even if it's just clicking that 5-star button, but particularly writing some nice words, we would, and me personally, massively appreciate it. We love doing this and it's just the best fun for me personally. So yeah, I'd massively appreciate it if you could head over to Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you get your podcasts from, and leave a 5-star review if you're feeling kind.